One last thing about Rahab in Joshua chapter 6. The Israelites came into Jericho, they took over the city, walls came down, they went straight in. It was a great victory. Just as they promised, they rescued Rahab and her entire family, brought them back to camp. At the end of Joshua chapter 6, it says that when Rahab and her family were brought back to camp, they were kept on the outside of the camp. So they weren't among the Israelites just yet. But then just a couple of verses later, it tells us how the story played out. That it says that, and Rahab and her family lived among the Israelites. They live among the Israelites to this very day, it says, which means up until the day that the book was actually written. And so it seems that there was a progression that took place. Whereas at the beginning, Rahab and her family were kept separated from the Israelites on the outside. Eventually they were welcomed by the Israelites. And I think that progression makes sense when you consider that Rahab and her family, they were Canaanites, they were the enemies. And the Israelites would have been at the very least skeptical of them. It's like, they're the enemy. They didn't want anything to do with us. We were supposed to overtake them and destroy them, and they were standing in the way between us and the promised land. And so now these Canaanites suddenly they were supposed to be their friends. Well, eventually, whatever took place, eventually they were. Eventually, these enemies reconciled in whatever way was necessary for Rahab and her family to live among the Israelites, to live among them as friends. And that's a pretty cool reconciliation when it takes place. Former enemies becoming friends, and I bet it took a little bit of time for them. For God, it happens much more quickly. The Bible describes us in multiple places as enemies of God. That's how we come into the world. That's how we're born. That's how we're conceived. Enemies of God. And I think you know what that means. It's what's behind the fact that nobody has to teach us how to do the wrong things. Those wrong things are written in our hearts from the very beginning. Greed, ego, selfishness, pride, arrogance, etc., etc., etc. You never took a class on how to do those things. You never had to read a book on, how to become better at those things. We're just all excessively good at those things because when we are born, we are enemies of God. We want nothing to do with Him. And so there are two groups that need to be reconciled. God and all of us who are on the outside of His camp, in a sense. And God makes it easy for us. The Bible tells us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still God's enemy, God loved us. It's a little different than what happened with Rahab. Rahab proved herself in a sense. She showed that she cared about the Israelites, or at least thought that they were on the right side, and she wanted to be closer to being on that right side than she had been. And so she proved herself in a sense, but that's not what we did. Before God chose to love us, and to love us in the hardest way of all, with the sacrifice that took place on the cross. He loved you before you ever loved Him. And if He loved you before you ever loved Him, boy, does He delight in loving you still. And He always will. The Israelites welcomed Rahab maybe a bit reluctantly. God welcomes you into His family gladly. Gladly. So much so that He did all the work necessary for making it happen. Just remember that about God. On days that you're seeing really clearly the worst of yourself, the days that you're seeing the worst of your heart show up, just remember God's heart towards you. Remember that He already showed it, and He always will. Rest well tonight, my friends.